Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very, very delighted to see this packed room. We're not at all surprised. We knew that tensions abound, that the topic would be very current, but such a pleasure to see so many people here in the room. My name is Ayelet Shacha. I'm the Harney Chair and here at the Munk School, and I'm trained in law, political science, and global affairs, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first event for the 2025 calendar year in the Harney Lecture Series. The Harney program is focused on questions of ethnic immigration and pluralism studies. It's a very special program. We're very interdisciplinary, and I just looking at the people in the room coming from different parts of the university and the general public. We were endowed, the Harney program was endowed by the Canadian government quite a few years ago to create a real special interdisciplinary intellectual space in which faculty, students, and many people, as I said, the general public can meet here and explore pressing, important domestic and international affairs related to questions of citizenship, membership, identity, and as we know, the focus for us for today, migration and border issues. And it's really a pleasure for me to welcome you to this space and to our special event today, which is going to be a moderated Q&A event among the panelists, which I will introduce momentarily. And then we'll also keep about 30 minutes for Q&A with the audience. So if you have any pressing question, just write it down. We will be sure to allow you time to ask questions. And I'm sure given the pressing issues that we're going to discuss, many of you will actually have questions. So now that we're officially in session, I want to just provide our land acknowledgement, the University of Toronto land acknowledgement, and then I'll introduce our speakers. So I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work here, to think here, to debate, to explore new ideas, as we will do today on this land. And in terms of our participants, we are absolutely delighted to have three speakers coming from different backgrounds and really contributing to the kind of set of questions that we would like to explore collectively. I'll go from the far end of the table, Leah Montange. She's an assistant professor here in American Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. She's a political geographer by training, and she's an expert in immigration enforcement and immigration detention in the US interior. We thought when we organized this panel, Leah, that your insights would be significant given the fast pace that we have seen of the executive orders. Definitely these questions about enforcement, detention, deportation are likely to become very central. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts and insights. Next to Leah, Marta Morgan is an experienced international economic policy and foreign policy expert. She has held some very senior leadership positions in the government of Canada. I'm not going to list all of them, but she was the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and she was also the Deputy Minister of Immigration. So two very, very significant portfolios for our discussion for today. She really has a tremendously rich experience in terms of what might speak to some of our students here. She's a graduate of McGill, but also of the Kennedy School of Government, holding a master's in public policy. And I know some people in the room are actually pursuing the Munk School's public policy degree. I'm sure many of you, Martha, would want to speak with you later on. So yeah, there's a seat over there. So welcome to the Munk School. I know you know the kind of work that we do here. Very delighted and grateful that you're here and will share with us some of your insights. Our third participant and speaker, Matina Stevis-Gridneff, sorry, of the New York Times. She is the new Canada Bureau Chief. We just had a small conversation before we came here. Matina moved to Toronto this summer. We were trying to convince her that this weather is not, it's a bit extreme even for us. So it has been a pretty cold winter. She moved here from Brussels, where she was the Time Bureau Chief there, leading the newspaper's coverage of the European Union through various crises, the coronavirus crises, the Ukraine crisis. She has done some tremendous work in different parts of the world. What I think for our purposes is most directly related to our topic for today is the work that Matina did in terms of reporting quite extensively on questions of immigration and displacement. Throughout her career, she has various distinguished awards that she has won. I'm just going to mention one of them, the 2016 One World Media Award, and that is related to some extent to some of the questions that we are exploring today, because that was for her reporting on the refugee exodus from Eritrea. So a lot of experience in terms of this particular field, questions of migration and border issues and enforcement issues and mobility issues. I also want to introduce to you very briefly our moderator and really the person who is responsible for bringing us here together, which my colleague Phil Triadopoulos. He is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And Phil has been very modest in terms of how he asked me to introduce him, just as a scholar of the politics of international migrations in North America and in Europe. I want to suggest to you that that, again, is a very modest presentation. He has done tremendously important work on questions of Canada and Germany in particular, published in some fantastic places, and has a real strong connection in terms of the Germany connection to the Hertie School, which again would be familiar to some people here at the Munk School, but also other universities, and has also been very involved in terms of publications, in terms of questions of migration in a comparative perspective. I was also partly recruited to the panel, so although I'm not listed there, you will hear me answering a few questions. And I guess just if I have to understand why I am here, it's due to the fact that I've written extensively about questions of citizenship and migration, including citizenship and birthright citizenship. So these are some of the topics that we will explore in our talk today. So where relevant, I will myself intervene. So without further ado, I want to turn the floor to Phil. And again, welcome our guests and looking forward to your questions later on when we get to the public Q&A. So thank you again for sharing your time with us this afternoon.
So I noticed one of our excellent MA students is here. Val, I think there's a seat. No, nothing. Nothing at all. Wow. I think we could drag a seat from
maybe
from
the
next
library.
door. Yeah. Great, thanks, Ayelet, for that generous introduction for all of us. So we'll go roughly from now until 5:30 or so, and then we'll break for questions from you. So as Ayelet pointed out, you can note your questions. Maybe they're so burning that they'll imprint themselves into your brain and you won't have to write them. I think there will be a lot of questions, so we want to leave at least half an hour to hear from you. I'll start with an icebreaker for everyone. So give us your best take on this one. What was your reaction to President Trump's speech during the inaugural ceremonies this past Monday, and to the executive orders that he signed shortly thereafter and through the day? What parts of the speech and which executive orders stood out to you and why?
That's the icebreaker.
That's the icebreaker. Yeah, that's serious stuff.
Okay, sure. I mean, I think it was broadly what we were anticipating. We knew that he would come in with a very clear and very specific vision of what he wants to do over the next 4 years. We knew that he would sign dozens of executive orders and that would set both the tone and the pace with which he wants to start this administration's work. I think that, you know, we had heard regarding the executive order pertaining to the birthright in the US, and there had already been some debate about whether it was legally sound, and he signed it and it's already being challenged, so that's barely any surprises there. I think that, you know, broadly as an audience and as observers, we were prepared. We saw play out what we expected. I personally wasn't particularly shocked or taken aback or surprised by anything that he said. I think one of the overarching themes that I saw was this redefinition of what it is to be an American. And there were different parts to it. Some are backward looking, some were forward looking. But I think he was very true to what he has always said he was going to do.
Thank you, Matina.
I agree with everything that was said. I suggested, I was actually really struck that he did the birthright citizenship as one of the early executive orders, because that's legally the most controversial aspect. It already is challenged by the courts. But I think you're right, it is who is an American. It's really trying to undo also case law that has been around for over 100 years. So this is really declaring that whatever was the status quo is no longer the status quo. So I think that was just, to me, striking. And it was, you're right, not surprising given the declarations, but just the intensity of it and also the broadness of how it was defined did actually surprise me.
I think my biggest takeaway was really the executive orders and the signaling of President Trump that he intends to get out of the gate really fast. It was an unprecedented number and an unprecedented scope of executive orders on the first day. And I think that it was intended as a sign of his commitment to follow through with the promises that he made in the campaign. And I think the number one focus, I mean, I haven't kind of done the math, but you know, there's probably more of them on immigration and the border and citizenship kind of thematically, you know, than probably any other subject. So that's clearly a big priority for him.
Thank you. Leah?
Yeah. I was so surprised by how presidential and composed and coherent the speech was. I noticed as an American Studies professor, and I teach core courses in American Studies, how many references there were to past presidential speeches and kind of core concepts from really that, he called it the new golden age of America, but the gilded age of America was referenced in many different ways in the speech. And I thought that was interesting. And I thought that my undergrads next year should read the speech and, you know, like see how much of it they can pick out. As for, you know, kind of that you know, like putting aside the bemused scholarly lens, though, it is very serious, very, very serious, very consequential what's happening. We didn't see anything in the executive orders on immigration that was surprising or particularly new. There weren't, to my eye, new strategies for immigration enforcement that were, or bordering that were being rolled out. But maybe a firming up and a restricting of things like, well, okay, here's one that I was a little surprised by. Restriction around work authorization, the way it's written in the enforcement or in the executive, what are they called? Executive order. Yeah. It sounds like people on temporary protective status or on parole might not be able to have work authorization anymore. We'll see how that plays out, but that's the way I read it when I'm reading it literally. And I thought that was pretty wild.
Leah, could you maybe, the way you kind of juxtapose the past and the proposed future, could you speak to where these proposed changes by President Trump, how they fit into a broader historical perspective, specifically the decision to declare illegal immigration along the US-Mexico border a national emergency? Is this sort of the culmination of a long-standing trend, or is it a rupture and a significant escalation in rhetoric and tactics?
I think it was he declared it a national emergency before, you know. I think that Biden revoked that, and he is revoking Biden's revocation. But if you look at what's going on at the US southern border, there's been a a decline in the number of enforcement actions over the past year, a very steep decline. And we're now at the kind of levels that we were seeing maybe, at the end of the Trump presidency, in terms of, how many enforcement actions are happening on a monthly basis. So we use the rhetoric of crisis in immigration enforcement in the United States in order to secure resources for immigration enforcement. It historically hasn't correlated with something happening that is actually extraordinary. So, we saw that in the early 80s with the Mariel boat lift, but we saw that like repeatedly throughout the 21st century, declarations of a border crisis. And then that becomes a way to expand, gain resources in order to expand the bordering infrastructure and the detention infrastructure, which will remain in place after the crisis ends, because that's capital that gets sunk into the landscape.
That was sort of a follow-up I'd have for you. Is there any end to this crisis? I mean, politically, would it be useful to have an end is one. And secondly, it's true that it's sort of a return from the past, but the sort of deputizing of American military forces to do things in border enforcement that are unspecified, right? And go against pretty strong conventions in the sort of relationship between the political and military branches of the US state. I mean, are the sort of cynics and pessimists like me reading too much into this? Or, I mean, is this something fundamentally different and more concerning?
We've used the military at the US-Mexico border, I think, at least since Obama. Every president's done that, but usually to do things like build walls, put up barbed wire, surveillance equipment, that kind of thing. So what is probably new to this administration probably doesn't feel new to me, because this rhetoric has been circulating for a while now, but he's calling it an invasion. It's an invasion without any sort of military power or military organization behind it, but he's somehow trying to parlay that rhetoric of invasion, which in the US context has been, immigration across that border has been framed as invasion since the 1970s, but he's applying that rhetoric as a legal rationale. And we know that the National Guard can go to the border and build infrastructure. And he's asked US Northcom to figure out what else it can do. Whether that's just providing equipment, providing training, we have this law, posse comitatus, where we can't have the military in the United States, taking military action against civilians. But that's been worn down over time in different ways.
Thanks. Does anyone want to follow up on that question? Move forward. I'm conscious that we have audience members who are at our border and aren't able to enter. And I would, I mean, I know there's rules about fire emergencies and things, but I wonder if we could get one of our helpers next door to haul some chairs in.
Solve the housing question.
I mean, I'm asserting, I'm declaring an emergency.
So we just need to add some infrastructure in order to shelter and house, and then it'll be fine.
It's a lot of people.
We need the work. We need the labor, though.
Okay, so as our guests come in and hopefully get seated, I notice initial forays and then they end. Can't do it?
Phil, I'm happy just to say one thing on the question of following up on Leah. I do actually think that one of the elements which was introduced was the option to sue localities and states if they were not enforcing immigration issues. That is actually quite significant, because we know that there are the sanctuary cities and other protections which, especially local, could be cities, could be smaller localities have introduced. So I think that fact is actually quite significant. That is something which I did not anticipate to see, at least not so early. So this is, obviously it's a federal issue, but they're now not only using potentially police forces, et cetera, to enforce immigration, they're actually potentially suing those jurisdictions that would say, no, we're actually opposing. That I think is quite dramatic. We'll have to see how that plays out.
So
Yeah,
none
I
of
don't
us
know.
on the panel is a federalism expert, but I mean, clearly there's some questions about the federal government's ability to constrain the decisions of Chicago, New York City, whose the Chicago police chief has said they will not assist in immigration and customs enforcement actions. Mayor Adams in New York City has said in more diplomatic terms, but he's not interested in cooperating. I guess for the whole panel, I mean, how do you see this playing out? Politically, is this, given the mood of the country, is this politically smart? It may play to parts of the Democratic base, but more generally, is this a good idea? And secondly, maybe this is asking too much of all of us, but in terms of relationships between the federal government, other state and local governments, what kind of crises does this portend? Want to get us started? Yeah. Is our resident
Yeah,
Americanist?
I can keep going. I don't want to take up, all the airtime. But yeah, he did threaten sanctuary jurisdictions now and in his previous administration. It's a bit different now. And so I don't know if we may have followed what was going on over the past couple of years with Governor Abbott busing people to cities, busing people who sought asylum and were in the asylum process to cities like Chicago and New York and Denver and other, so-called sanctuary, jurisdictions, which played out as like a major effort to try to find people housing and stuff. And get them situated in those cities. And I think that sympathy for immigrants, a sense of interconnectedness and solidarity has potentially worn thinner in those places like Chicago and New York than what it was, than how it was in 2020, right? So I am concerned that Chicago, New York, Seattle won't hold out the way that they did to those that when they were threatened with threatened by Trump over being sanctuary jurisdictions before.
Did you want to comment on this?
I mean, I do want to caveat everything I say by stating that the longest I've ever spent in the United States continuously is 3 weeks. I've worked for American newspapers my entire career, but I've never lived there. I'm a Greek, born and raised in Greece, who's covered immigration in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and now Canada. And so I'm not an expert in federalism, state central relations, or anything. What I can say from my international experience, however, is that the rehashing that is we're 10 years into a broader reckoning of immigration systems, laws, and enforcement across the developed world. And what that looks like is there are 3 pieces to what it looks like elsewhere, which I know American exceptionalism is a thing, but actually humans tend to behave in similar manners across the world. So one piece is the courts. And I think that President Trump is coming in very strongly determined to try and align the different branches of the state and of the government behind his vision. One of his key philosophical complaints is that all those different branches of government have developed too much autonomy and they don't fall behind the democratic choice. And so I think the courts will have a really big role to play, and we're seeing it already play out. The other will be center peripheral relationships. And There will be costs and punishments to holding out, but there will also be benefits, likely political benefits to holding out in blue states. In the United States, I would posture that that will just reinforce a segregation of the country between blue and red. And I think it will just reinforce identity until those costs and benefits become more crystallized. I think for the administration, it will be hard to say that states can't do this when they are throwing so many other key vital issues to states, reproductive rights being one of them. So that's good for states, but other stuff isn't. And then the third issue is the question of commanding, going beyond convention and rules pertaining to the use of forces such as border forces, immigration officials, officers, and so on, to do things differently. And my experience on that, mostly from Europe, is that those forces do tend to follow the executive until challenged in court seriously, in which case the executive tends to support them because they're implementing that. And within probably 3 or 4 years, new cultures take hold in those enforcement branches. My personal experience is with border guards, but I think that other agencies are not immune to this. There is a personnel, then you have a pipeline of people who are self-selected. They choose to do these jobs because they like what the new mandate looks like. They like being hardline and so on. And it doesn't really take a long time for, especially in a presidential system, for that kind of direction that is so clearly coming from the top with such determination and force to start bleeding into all those pockets that may present resistance, institutional or political, to what the will of the president in this case is.
No, thank you very much. Marta, so one of the pledges that President Trump made on Monday was to expand the practice of extreme vetting, not only to applications for immigration, but also to visa applications. And of course, we know that Canadians apply for American visas to study and work all the time. Is this an issue that, in your opinion, Canada should challenge, sort of with the same seriousness that they're challenging the proposal to apply tariffs, crippling tariffs? You know, is it this? I haven't heard anything about it, which suggests that if our officials are doing anything, they're doing it very quietly and diplomatically. Do you think this is the right approach? And if you had a megaphone and were asked and able to give advice to your colleagues who are responsible for this file, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, you know, I think this is one of those areas where we need to know more about what this actually means. You know, I don't think it's the only one of the executive orders that were signed where it's not quite clear how these broad directions are going to be implemented. You know, this is going to have to be implemented by the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is part of U.S. Homeland Security. You know, and with a large number of people coming to the U.S. every year from all over the world to study, to work, and to visit, you know, they're going to need to prioritize how they do this. So what's this really, what are they really vetting for? Is this about security threats? Is this about individuals who may be seeking to enter the US as visitors, but not intending to leave when their visa expires? You know, will this lead to the US putting in place more sort of across the board stringency in terms of vetting of individuals for visas, or will it be more targeted? You know, so, you know, I think this is an area where there's a lot of layers that need to be unpacked here. And the best approach, I think, for, you know, for Canada is to try and find out more. And there's lots of relationships at various levels, and there will be more relationships that get established as the new administration puts their appointments into place, where more information can be sought about that, I think, before we determine what the next best actions are or whether it'll implicate Canadians in a significant way.
So wait and see rather than get in front of.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Matina, so we know the results of the November election. We know the results of polls conducted up to and even after the election. We know, therefore, that Americans are deeply concerned with immigration and border control. I mean, quite strikingly. And they favor many of the policies proposed by President Trump. We also know, as you suggested a minute ago, that these trends in public opinion are not exceptional in the least. They're broadly shared across industrialized democracies. And, you know, recently seemed to be the trend followed in Canada as well, as regards Canadians' views on immigration. How does the election of President Trump affect the politics of immigration in Europe and Canada? With respect to Canada, if you were betting, what would you expect Conservative candidates, and especially the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, to do with respect to immigration? Is this an opportunity to exploit a traditionally conservative issue and in a way that's consonant with public opinion? Is 2025 the year, the federal election, that ends this long-standing consensus among federal political parties in Canada on immigration? Do you think it's going to be a ballot issue?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Let me take your question from the beginning. I think that I think that resistance to immigration and immigrants is particularly surprising in the New World, because these are countries that identify as immigrant countries. And I'm thinking here, Australia, of course, Canada, the United States. And what we've seen is that they have reached a level of really resistance of public opinion at different moments. So in Australia, the stop the boats rhetoric, the shift against immigrants happened earlier with broad support. And we've seen that play out, and Australia has been the most innovative, and I don't say this as a positive thing, I say it as in its literal sense, innovative in areas that we might start seeing more of in the United States and Europe, such as extraterritorialism, so having people processed outside your territory and so on. What I'm hearing from the United States right now is this "we're full" concept. Like, this country's full. We don't have stuff to share. We don't have any more. And I think the experience, Leah mentioned this earlier, the experience of blue states, of people getting bussed in and experiencing the scarcity of housing and so on, made that a sentiment more broadly shared than it was previously. And that obviously very clearly informed the elections. That feeling has been very present in Europe. Europe has a different set of fundamentals, including, you know, maybe some more claims to blood and soil rhetoric and so on, but at the same time, a very aging population. It's a different kind of set of thoughts, but I also think that Europeans have contributed greatly to the discourse, the words, the thoughts, the expressions being really integrated into the political playbook and the rhetoric across the New World. What is the impact of Trump's not only election, but also his single-minded pursuit of an anti-immigration agenda? It is actually a very similar effect to the effect that his attitude has on other policy areas. It gives license to policymakers and politicians who may be more on the fringe of their political parties and they say, well, look, America's America, the land of immigrants, is pursuing these policies, so why shouldn't we? I think that it gives ideas on how to do it to countries that may not have the checks and balances the United States has. And it it creates a sense of consensus around anti-immigration policies, which may not be entirely true, and it also may not be permanent, but for this moment anyway, for this period. So that's one, I think, significant impact. Canada, I believe, continues to have, and in my very brief experience here, I've been here for 6 months, but in those 6 months, the immigration debate has obviously been really fired up. And my observation from listening very closely to Pierre Poilievre and what he says about immigration is that he is so to the left of your global median conservative politician. It is remarkable. And I know that that sounds surprising to Canadians, because I believe he's also very to the right of traditional conservatives here. But I believe what will be on the ballot will be a tight and better management of a continuously expanding immigration system. And that is by virtue of Canada's completely unique characteristics, which you all know, I don't need to tell you about, including geography and the sparsity of the population. There will be pockets of immigration policy that he will seek to tighten, I believe. And we already know some of them, international students, temporary worker permits. He has a populist, anti-capitalist strand to him. So I wouldn't be surprised if he is confrontational with parts of industry that push for those types of immigrant workers. I would also not be surprised if he tightens further refugee programs, because those were so central to Trudeau's brand and Canada's brand. And I feel that that era is coming to an end. So those would be my expectations.
Thanks so much. Marta, you wanted to come in?
Yeah. So look, I agree with what Matina said. We have seen in the last 6 or 7 years, a couple of increases in Canadians' dissatisfaction with Canadian immigration policy. The first was when Roxham Road became an issue, and when we had a dramatic increase in irregular migration, between the border posts, and Canadians by virtue of our geography have been, largely insulated from that kind of movement across the border. But when it happened and it seemed unorderly and it seemed not controlled, it was not popular. And then more recently, because of sort of the interaction between the large increase in immigration, both temporary and permanent, and increases in price of housing and housing accessibility and all of the other kind of pressures. So when it's seen to kind of interact with domestic pressures where it's not seen to be helpful. But that being said, it is we are in a different situation from the perspective. We have a lot of first generation immigrants in Canada. And so there is a lot of base support, I think, for immigration in Canada, where it's seen as one of our strengths. We're seen as having been pretty good in the past at having a well-managed immigration system. And so I think what you're seeing in terms of the political debate so far, at least, is really about, we need better management. It needs to be more controlled. It's been let to get out of control, but not kind of the anti-immigration, but let's go back to, this past where we had, a more controlled immigration system, and that will work for us.
Thank you. Ayelet, we've talked about a few exceptionalism. Historically, the Canada-US border has been thought of as just different than the US-Mexico border. Is that distinction going to hold moving forward? Or do you expect that the US borders are going to be treated similarly, regardless of history?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. But before I do that, I'm going to put on my other hat as the organizer and thank Political Science and the Center for the Studies of the US for co-sponsoring us. But then I'll jump now to your question. Historically, yeah, definitely. The US-Canada border has been seen as very different, the northern US border from the southern US border. And we've seen this now with the kind of the military presence at the border, the southern border, right? So I would expect those two borders to remain different. Nevertheless, I was struck actually by the language, and to some extent, I think the Canadian government preempted the concern that some of the rhetoric now that was the southern US border is now somehow creeping into the discussion about Canada. And that's, if you remember, preemptively, even after Trump was elected before the inauguration, Canada declared that it's going to put in $1.3 billion to protect the border. Now, you may recall, right, they're both land borders, which is very interesting because the territoriality of the border, and Matina, this actually connects to a point that you said, the border, when we think about the border, like if I were to ask all of you in the room, what's your image of a border? I bet many of you would say it's a barbed wire, it's a wall or something physical. And indeed, that's our traditional conception of the border. But a lot of bordering activities, and again, Europe is the great example, doesn't occur at the border. It occurs way, way, way before anyone crosses the border. And that's actually the way that Europe is now trying to deal with the border, to push back the border to Africa, to the eastern, southern, right, to make sure that no one actually reaches the border. It's especially significant for asylum seekers, because if you don't reach the territory, you don't have a legal right to seek protection. I say all of that because I think in this discussion about the northern border, we have seen Canada, given that it's a very, very long border, it's the longest border, actually a peaceful border in the world, there's no way that you can actually build a wall. And I think no one in the US would even sort of use that rhetoric. However, saying that Canada, you remember these unfounded claims about millions of people crossing the border without permission into the US. Even if it's not true, it doesn't matter, because a lot of this, and this actually, I think you said this earlier, Leah, in immigration, we know this, and Phil, you know this from your own studies, right? So much of it is perception. It has nothing to do at some point with the facts. It doesn't matter if the numbers are really, really small, as they are currently, right? We haven't seen there's no crisis actually at the US southern border. Nevertheless, the pictures are such, the perception is such, and once it sticks politically, you can't sort of undo it. And I think the concern for Canada would be that this doesn't stick, right? That it doesn't seem as a border which is in crisis. I think preemptively what the Canadian government did by saying we will put in the money, most of it is probably going to be technology. We'll have more drones, etc. Things like policing, surveilling the border, really. You can't really mend that border. It's not just a wall, it's just too long. So I guess it's just trying to ease these concerns. I also think, and Marta, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. My thought is that it also serves the Canadian government's interest independently of the US because of Roxham Road, precisely because Canada, the support for immigration, and again, Phil, I'm drawing on your work, has for so long been, because it has been seen as exceptional in the sense that immigrants were beneficial. Many of our immigrants come in as employment-based immigrants. They're they're skilled, they contribute to the economy, they're a sense of growth in terms of not just the economy, but also in terms of demographic growth, that almost all of it comes from immigration. And it's orderly, and this element of orderly, and again, if you look at the 2015 crisis in Europe, all of it was about the sense of what's going on, like these people are coming in, who's going to stop it? No one knows what's happening, right? When you lose that sense of orderly management, and I think all of us on the panel would agree on that, I think that becomes politically very, very complicated to address. And I think for the Canadian government putting in that money and saying, well, we are worried that the US would start deporting people, or it would stop the temporary protection status, the TPS, for certain groups, as they did initially with the Haitians. It could be other groups, and then people will try to cross the border. Then Canada would have in its hand a crisis, right? So I think it's also beneficial for the Canadian government to say, we'll surveil the border, we'll make sure that it's under control. It's good for us in our negotiations or our relationship with the US, whatever leverage is trying to be, the US is trying to create by saying that there might be a future crisis. It also, I think, domestically would be just a good strategy. And this is true, I think, whichever government we have is the Canadian interest. You're just given the domestic populations wanting to keep the issue in check.
I wanted just to say something to your earlier question, and you've just reminded me. My wild card in the scenario that we do see even pockets of displacement crisis, people fleeing roundups in the United States coming north, which I think would not necessarily be an organized thing. It could be just opportunistic, that this is the closest place where you can flee to, is what would the Canadian public think if media coverage was showing violent roundups, separation of families, and this sort of, unorganized, chaotic scene were to crash out at the border with the United States? I would, again, only been here 6 months, but I would posit that people who are fatigued with immigration, but had previously been in favor of both humanitarian and just being more open, might marginally change their minds. Should that be the context? Should there be displacement of people under visible duress? And we're all consuming this in the press. And people came up to the Canadian border trying to cross in. And of course, legally, that would throw up the third safe country agreement, which we have with the United States, which is a separate conversation.
Well, it is the conversation that we're trying to,
Yeah.
yeah, so this is a perfect segue. You guys have done a masterful job setting things up. So Leah, you wanted to come in on this?
But not on safe third country. But
No, I mean,
I just wanted to say the other thing that could happen, because we know that when we like try to restrict movement across borders, it just changes the routes of that movement. It doesn't stop the
It
movement.
gets more dangerous.
I mean, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that happened at the end of the Trump administration before COVID was that the number of unauthorized crossings started increasing a lot because of the way that authorized crossings were being shut down at the southern border. One thing that could happen though is the reroute can happen through Canada. And so I know that in I think it was 2023, a family died crossing the Lawrence River. Is it called St. Lawrence? St. Lawrence, sorry, I'm so sorry. I know that, but it just, it's the St. Lawrence River. I'm not from this region. So, yeah, so, and from Canada into the US, and so yeah, we could see again, people trying to flee the US into Canada. We could also see people routing, through Canada into the US in dangerous ways. A lot of what happens with immigration flows in the US context has to do with where the labor market is at. So that's possibly one of the factors that has driven down immigration into the US over the past years. The labor market was cooling. Anyway, there's not a lot that governments can do in my mind. I'm so sorry, Marta, if you totally disagree with me about this, to stop immigration from happening. But we affect the routes that it takes. And that from Europe, Matina, yeah.
I mean, this is exactly the question I wanted to ask Marta. I mean, are we better prepared in 2025 than we were in 2017-18? We being Canadian officials to manage a spike in unauthorized arrivals, irregular border crossings. I mean, I guess that's the question. Have we learned in the interim, or are we going to handle this as a sort of surprise again, even though it's a surprise that no one should treat as a surprise?
Well, I mean, my advice would be like, this is just a very unpredictable situation and we have to be prepared for anything to happen. And, I think that let's comment that so much of what happens is a question of perception, right? So when you're in a situation where there's media coverage of the potential of deportations happening from urban centers and that sort of thing. And if we do see media coverage of that, and, will that create sort of a level of fear and anxiety that will cause people to move in significant numbers? We don't really know. We don't really know, how serious and sustained those efforts will be in the United States, because, we know that the kind of actions that the Trump government has indicated that they're planning to take are also very resource intensive, right? This is not easily done. This requires a lot of resources of government, some of which will require congressional approval. So there's a distance between aspiration and action, but there's also sometimes a distance between perception and what's happening. And, when we look back at Roxham Road, what we saw was initially movement of Haitians who had immigration status in the US that was going to in the future be rescinded, but hadn't yet been. But then it became very multinational because kind of the word got out Like it was, after the first few months, much of the migration wasn't really about that at all. It was just because there was a pathway that people were aware of now, and they used it, right?
Eric Adams became aware of it. Eric Adams used it. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I think that, have we learned the lessons? Well, I think it's still pretty fresh in the federal government. I'll certainly tell you, when I was the Deputy Minister of Immigration in 2017 when Roxham Road happened, and it was at that time, it had been a long time since we'd really had significant issues at the border, but it's pretty recent now, and I'm sure that people are getting ready for it. But you're never going to be able to completely prepare, because these things, they ebb and they flow, they're unpredictable, they depend on things that are not necessarily measurable, and so you just kind of have to be ready to adapt as you go. And they also require a lot of resources, and we don't really think of that outside government as much, but when you think about, okay, well, what happens when someone actually turns up at the border, and what needs to be done, and how do you actually take care of them and ensure their well-being until you can take whatever action is appropriate. All of those things actually require people, and they require facilities, and they require a lot of things that you can't just kind of stand up in a minute.
I want to get back to this, but I had a long wind up before the questions the last two questions, and I think maybe it'd be helpful for the audience and for us as well, just as a reminder, what came out of Monday's announcements. So, of course, the doing away with temporary protection status for Haitians was a big deal and caused a spike in unauthorized arrivals in 2017 and 18. But I mean, he's now calling for the same thing to be done from folks from Afghanistan, Burma, Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua, and other places. In addition to that, there's been a call to use immigration and customs enforcement officials to conduct operations in churches and schools, doing away with a prohibition under the last outgoing administration. And of course, there's been a strong position against transgender non-binary people, which raises issues about, grounds for asylum. So I don't think we should, I think that the likelihood of something like 2017-18 is quite likely. And insofar as, how we respond, of course, we can't respond until we see what happens, absolutely. But it does raise some questions. One question, Ayala, is, we were quite proud of renegotiating the Safe Third Country Agreement and making the border coherent and plugging up some, to use a nasty metaphor, but plugging up gaps in our enforcement measures. But there's exemptions in that agreement, as you know well. And with these changes and, the likely mix of people coming to the border and asking for asylum, is this new agreement, is it going to sort of be like a car you buy and then you crash into a pole the first day you own it? Is it going to do any work, or is it already are the exemptions that would be used if Canada takes a more humanitarian position, so frequent and likely that we won't have a Safe Third Country Agreement anymore?
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball. This is a tough one, right? Because I think, Marta, it connects to your point. How many people are gonna, I guess the numbers here would actually matter. Obviously, what the renegotiation did, just for the audience, we had the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States, pretty much modeled on the European kind of Safe Third Country Agreements, which basically says if someone is already was seeking asylum in country A and now they're trying to cross to country B is permitted to push that person back to country A. And it reduces the agency of migrants. That is someone who's like someone, I'm guessing like Leah, right, who does this, I would guess more the migrants' perspective.
Yeah.
There's a lot of criticism of that, but from a government's perspective, it's just a distribution, right, of who has to hear a protection claim, and you can't have simultaneous protection claims. So that's the technicality, and it used to occur at a port of entry. That is, if you were crossing at a recognized port of entry, then someone could actually check your visa, your passport. They can ask you, have you started an asylum process in the US or vice versa? And that was the initial agreement. But many people smartly actually said, well, if I'm not crossing through a port of entry, no one is going to interview me. And that's how we had Ruxham Road, right? It didn't apply unless you were crossing through the port of entry. What the renegotiated agreement did is now every place that you cross the border, the safe third country agreement applies. That's the distinction, which means that now, in theory, let's assume someone is crossing, in our example, from the US to Canada due to all of these concerns of deportation, of potentially even just detention, etc. Then in theory, the Canadian officials, whomever, let's assume it's border officials, can push you back. And that would be permitted unless you fall into, there are actually 4 exemptions. One is unaccompanied children. I would think Canada would uphold that. So if we see, and we've seen a lot of this, actually the US southern border, a lot of the movement is unaccompanied children. So we might see the same thing. I hope, I actually do hope that Canada still respects that, right? Not unaccompanied children, I would assume would not be pushed back. If you have potentially qualifying family members in Canada, then again, you fall into the exception. So it could be that someone is now currently in the US, but has a family member here, they would fall under the exception. I think that would be definitely respected by the Canadian government. The third is if you have a valid visa to enter Canada, for example, then again, you fall into the exemption. I think the most interesting one would be the public interest. That's sort of a basket category that says, it's a public interest, and that would be up to the government to determine how it's interpreted. I actually think that on the non-binary, transgender, etc., Canada traditionally has actually been more open to these kinds of claims than the United States. So I would hope that would remain the tradition. So I think anyone who falls into these categories would be safe, but I don't think that someone who's just passing out of concern about what the US situation might be, given the current political atmosphere in Canada, that they would actually be given a hearing and begin the asylum process and all of the protections that come with that. Because in Canada, that actually means that there's a whole host of things that come with the protection status, or even if you're just going through the asylum process and just your claim is being heard, and that could take years, that could take a long period of time. So I guess a long way of saying there are exceptions. I do think that I would hope that those would be upheld, but that doesn't cover the majority of people, I'm guessing. And again, I'm guessing given that we don't really know who's going to cross.
Fair.
And of course, I don't foresee a Poliev government accepting asylum requests from transgender people fleeing the Trump administration. We know what the prime minister thinks about, not prime minister, the aspiring prime minister thinks about that. And to the extent that there is, agency to determine, there would be political criteria applied.
Because it's public interest, that could be defined in so many different ways.
Marta, did you want to come in on this? No? Okay. Leah, so Americans have voiced support for tough enforcement measures. But, we know that what you say in an interview with a survey company isn't necessarily something you'd support when you see it happening in your community, in your workplace, in your place of worship. How much leeway are Americans willing to grant the Trump administration in this deportation project? I mean, will they support ICE staff pulling children out of classrooms or marching into church basements to carry out enforcement measures? How will American employers in the construction, hospitality, agricultural sectors respond to the deportation of thousands of prized employees? I mean, are there moral and structural limits to the Trump administration's deportation plan?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that question, because I wrote a dissertation about this actually, and I have writing published in geography journals about it, because I did field work in a community that voted for Trump, I think every time he's been up on the ballot. But when ICE started coming to call an agricultural community, it was a big problem for most people. It was a big problem for the growers, in this agricultural community. It was a big problem for the people who were in the school system. It was a big problem for the people who were working in the tourism industry. It was also a beach town tourist kind of community with hotels and restaurants. Businesses had to scale back. but also people were losing, US citizens were losing their neighbors and their friends. And there was this really like wild interview because the BBC went out there to check it out, what was going on. And they interviewed, I think he was the sheriff, he was a law enforcement officer, and he was like, we didn't mean Mario, like not Mario, you know, because they had voted for Trump without really actually thinking about how that community of citizens was very interconnected with a community of non-citizens. And that is a story that we, you know, that's the story that I know best because that's where I was working and living, but that story can be transposed all over the US. And yeah, I mean, if they want to go after people with schools, that's where the interconnection between citizens and non-citizens is one of the places where that interconnection is felt most deeply, you know, because children are friends with each other and the teachers really care about their students. And the rest of the school staff really cares about their students. My prediction for how this is going to go down, it's not a prediction, it's a recollection of 2018, and there was a crisis at the border, not the kind of crisis that the government, you know, says it's a crisis. It was a horrible humanitarian crisis, and we call it the family separation crisis. And this is where the US, you know, gets creative with its enforcement actions and gets particularly cruel in order to deter migration. And people didn't like it. People didn't like to see it. And it was, it damaged the Trump administration's credibility. It damaged the Trump administration's moral, whatever kind of credibility it had. They had to walk back. And it is part of what gave Biden the mandate to be less cruel and more humanitarian in the way that he was dealing with immigration at the border, which was not to be lax on it. Biden was very tough at the border. From my analysis of like the data that's come out, that's, you know, shown what happened over time over those 4 years. So I think something like that will happen. You know, we'll see a disaster, and people, you know, there'll be miniature disasters in people's communities where they realize that they didn't mean Mario, and there'll be some sort of large scale disaster that reminds people, right, this isn't actually what we can tolerate. I think that's what'll happen. And it'll be, of course, not just employers or citizens like paying the price. Of course, it'll be the people who are, you know, who that state violence is directed against, who will be paying the price for it.
Thank you.
Just to comment on that, for those of you who do follow the news closely, you may have seen a clip of the bishop giving the inaugural service. And just for those of you who didn't, she asked the president to show mercy, which is a very Christian message, of course. And she said to show mercy to people fearing family separation, deportation, as when she also mentioned, you know, transgender and just the broader LGBTQ community. And I feel like, yes, obviously, she actually specifically said, Mr. President, she was speaking to him, he was there. But I feel like she also verbalized a call for mercy to his supporters and people who may identify religiously as Christians or otherwise who support Trump. And I think she was also speaking to them. You know, in the next few weeks, you may see these things happen, and remember, you know, God's teachings about mercy, which I thought was, you know, I think people focused a lot on the personal message of the Bishop Trump sort of thing, but it could have been a broader call to find that resistance within communities of, I didn't mean Mario, and also people who might feel offended by the way it happens. Whether that will change anything is really, I would say, questionable in the short run, especially.
So this gets to the question I wanted to ask you. You think, well, I mean, that's the hope, right? That when faced with cruelty, people respond in that way. and I hope so too. And but I think we're living through, if you take public opinion seriously, if you take the actions of government serious, if you take the rhetoric of political leaders seriously, it seems that we're living through a hinge moment in history. Yeah. So there's really strong anti-immigration opinion right across the industrialized democracies. It's shared at the elite and popular level. And I wonder, Matina, I mean, are we living through a period where support for mobility, mobility of goods, mobility of people, mobility of ideas, has fallen out of favor?
Yes.
And that we're, going back into the future, a future of blood and soil, of kin and country.
Yes. So I have a few thoughts on this. I think yes is the shortest answer. Again, as I said earlier, some of these trends are so dynamic, and I don't think we should all believe that this is permanent. However intense it is, however different it is right now, I do think that attitudes toward newcomers are a dynamic historical trend, and they change, and politics change with them. I think we have to believe public opinion. We have to believe voters. One of the reasons we're here is because voters feel they were not believed. If you'll permit, I'll share a brief story. When I arrived here in August, in September, I called a non-governmental organization that offers legal help to people crossing between the United States and Canadian border. And I said to the woman I was speaking to, who was a lawyer, I said, I'm really interested in whether you're seeing trends of reversal, people moving south rather than people moving north, which had been the trend previously. Because that's what we're seeing in the data. There's more people moving south. And are you experiencing this? And she said to me, I hope you don't, linger too much on the complaints of the communities living at the border, because they are expressing, a lot of racist sentiments, and who are these people? And I said to her, you know what, actually, I think you have to bring maximum empathy to understanding how communities, including communities at the border who don't like people walking through their property in the middle of the night, are feeling. And one of the reasons that we're here is that these people were called names. They may very well be racist, I don't know. But there has been an administrative failure in managing the movement of people, and people have not been listened to. And I think that's partly why we're here. As an aside, I think that with regards to attitudes toward immigration, there is a question of identity. I think a lot of countries drew identity points out of being accepting of immigration, welcoming, give me your wretched, you're poor, we are an immigrant country, we welcome you, we need you, this is the immigrants built this country, and there's been an identity shift to we're full. I mentioned this earlier about the New World particularly. And I think there's another component, which is bigger, more existential, mind-bogglingly difficult, which is we are past the inflection point of prosperity in the developed world, and there's less to share around, and that's not a perception. Scarcity is a reality. And the way I think Marta made such an excellent point about the confluence of an immigration situation and resource allocation, access to resources such as housing and healthcare and so on, and that's real. And I think that's why we're also seeing a broader public dislike of newcomers. And it's not personal, it is Mario, but it's, and I know that long-term migrants contribute positively to economic growth and availability, but short-term, they're net takers from those systems until they settle, and so on.
They need work authorization in order to not be net
I absolutely,
takers.
yes, and I absolutely agree with that. And that's why I also think that, I think it was you who mentioned earlier, or maybe it was Phil's question about you know, what happens when there's people, not no people to do the jobs, like the community you studied, right? The agricultural community. I think those changes in sentiment will be felt very quickly once the impact
It's-
of a crackdown.
Yeah,
you
I
know.
mean, the US has low unemployment compared to Canada.
Yes.
So it is gonna be a real problem in agriculture, tourism and construction.
Yeah, absolutely.
If Trump's is able to do the crackdown that he says he's planning to do.
Yeah, I did caveat my response
Yeah.
saying that this is a dynamic thing. People's emotions do change. I'm merely
Yeah.
seeking to explain this moment with the tools that I have. And I think that these are the things that are coming into what you call the hinge moment right now. Is it going to be forever? No, because there's going to be all these old people in Europe that there's no one there to look after them. There's no one to do the jobs. Communities are going to suffer. We know those things. It will change, but for now, I think this is where we are, or that's my best.
The scarcity in the United States is contrived, though. There's such wealth in that.
But it's
place.
poorly distributed.
It's not distributed in a way,
Yeah.
that where working people can feel it. Yeah.
Marta,
Well, I
oh, sorry,
think
go
the
ahead.
other thing in the US is that because so much immigration has come from the southern border, because so much of the immigration has been kind of sort of irregular at the beginning until people get regularized, they actually have a much less effective economic immigration system. We've had, when I was at immigration, we had a lot of conversations with our US counterparts about how do you have a really good economic immigration system, because Canada's system at that time was, really strong, the point system, and able to attract and retain, excellent, really qualified people. And the US's version of that is really squeezed because they've got such a big family immigration program. They've got such a big asylum program, right? And they've got such a big sort of set of undocumented immigrants. And so they've never really managed to build the political consensus either to have an immigration system that has kind of that foundational broad support. And I think over time, that's also probably one of the reasons why you've seen kind of that erosion of support.
Thank you. Matina, you had a point?
Oh, no, the one thing I did want to say, and you mentioned the access to the labor market. Obviously, the other piece that's completely failed and been terribly managed in many places, not so much Canada though, is the integration component. We do know that communities that consider themselves centered around shared ideals, rules, and broadly speaking identities are better functioning communities. They're easier communities to govern. And this idea that I don't recognize my community, people really rush to attach racism to that. But I think that would be quite displaced in a place like, say, Canada, which is just so immensely diverse. I think there is a problem too, I think and I'm very guilty of this, we take agency away from newcomers and immigrants. They also, there's also an onus on them to participate and an onus on the state to offer rights. I think Canada does a much better job, but access to the labor market, healthcare, education, all of those things, paths to integrating meaningfully, language, and so on, I think are critical.
Yeah.
And looking at failures right now should also contain the integration component.
Part of the restrictionist politics at the state and local level in the United States has been to strip back from, things like language.
Yeah, and in Europe, we call that the
Yeah.
doctrine of a hostile environment.
Yeah.
You're gonna make it really unpleasant all the way and people won't come. And guess what? It doesn't work because people want better lives.
Marta, so I've asked you a few, crystal ball questions. They're not fair, and I think
That's why I refuse
this
to
one
answer.
is less crystal ball, but it's probably worse.
I know that trick.
So we know how Canada responded early on to demands by President-elect Trump to stop the flow of illegal immigrants and fentanyl. Yeah. So there's a whole package of policies that were released not long ago. So the part one of the question is, do you think that was an appropriate response? The second one is a bit future oriented. It's, you know, how willing should Canadian officials be to say, yes, yes, we shall. What is our red line? I mean, what kinds of potential demands do we say no? I mean, we've already seen Mexico's president do this, say, you know, okay, we're willing to work up until a point, but here we will not work with you. So I don't know, I don't have something in mind, I'm not trying to be coy, but is there something that comes to mind to you where you think Canadian officials would say, you know, you're our partner, but we're not going to work with you on this?
So maybe I'd just start by saying that, you know, Canada and the US have historically had a remarkable degree of trust with respect to managing our border. And that has served both Canada and the US well. It served us well in terms of trade, in terms of tourism, in terms of the communities who are cross-border, right? I mean, this is one of the things that we noticed during COVID. You know, at that time, I was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we kept getting calls from our embassy about the border communities where someone had a cottage on one side of the border, and people were kind of, they were really frustrated, right? Because they were used to a degree of openness and trust that allowed us to operate, you know, as a community. And so, you know, I think if we think of it that way, that it's worth investing in and it's worth preserving that trust. And so I think that what the government has done thus far, you know, to indicate that it's going to invest more in border security, you know, that it's going to invest more in the visa processing system to make sure that we're kind of making it more, you know, just making sure that people who are coming here to Canada to stay. You know, I think that those investments are reasonable and they serve our interests and as well as the interests, you know, of the United States. In terms of like what Canada might do in the future, look, I really think it has to be seen within the context of the broader tensions with the Trump administration, the threats that the president has made to impose across the board tariffs on Canada, the looming review of CUSMA that is coming up in 2026. And, you know, anything else that we do will need to be seen from that perspective and be part of a broader strategy.
Does anyone else want to come in on any of the points we've raised so far?
I'm happy to say where I would draw the line, and I think it's a very simple one, right? I don't think Canada should accept being the 51st state of the United States, right? So I think that's an easy one. That's an easy one. But I do think that the question that, and in a way, following up on Matina's points, clearly something is going on, right? We can just say, clearly there is a shift. I would want to think about immigration in the context of a broader set of policies, because I don't think we can really understand the anti-immigrant sentiment unless we really take into account some kind of issue linkages, or just thinking about this as a broader picture. What has happened to citizenship? Because historically we would have said citizenship is about a status, it's about legal rights, it's about identity, it's about all of these things that bring together people in a community and also have a special, these individuals have a special relationship to a given government. Let's assume we're talking about democratic societies. And I think partly the reason why we're seeing potentially this anti-immigrant sentiment has to do with the fact that so many people are really feeling that they were left behind. So I would think it's partly the fact that citizenship has just undergone this very strange set of contrasting changes. To some extent, what traditionally we would call, like in a Marshallian kind of concept, right, social citizenship has been thinned out, even in a country such as Canada. I mean, the US really doesn't have a welfare state to begin with. Even European societies, I spent 5 years as a director of a Max Planck Institute in Germany. Germany has a very, very, to my North American mind, generous welfare system, but people would always complain to me about how it was better, right? They had 60, I don't know, they had 30 days, now they can only have 24 days off of vacation or what have you. It doesn't matter, it's relative, but people felt that they had less. So I think partly what's going on is that whatever people got from being a citizen in a given community, they feel like they get less. And it's true that the distribution is such that given the deep inequalities, not just between countries, but also within countries, it is true that you probably are getting less. And we can maybe go country by country, right? But nevertheless, people might feel that their citizenship is thinner. At the same time, they're feeling there are more newcomers. They're also potentially feeling that globalization has impacted them. You know, there's so many different things that are occurring that to some extent, it's such an easy scapegoat to say it's about the immigrants. And therefore, it's so easy to mobilize that sentiment, where in fact, it could be that we need to invest much, much more in retraining of individuals who just no longer have the relevant skills in a modern economy. So it could be that the reasons for this kind of anti-immigrant sentiment are so much broader. And to some extent, I don't think if we only think about immigration, we won't get to all of these root causes. We really need to take a more comprehensive view.
I agree with you.
I mean, I'm just, your opening comment, Leah, about the new golden/gilded age kind of framed it, that point very well. And I'm reminded that during the inauguration, seated behind the president's family were Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and one tech guy, I don't remember his name.
Another one.
Similarly rich. Well, thank you so much. I think we'll now open up the discussion for
That's great.
questions from you, our audience. So you can use my microphone. So please state your name and whether you're a student or whatever your affiliation happens to be. And if you could keep your comments and questions brief, then more people will have a chance.
Thank you, Ali Dad Mafinez. I'm a member of the public. I'm wondering if you could talk about how we might promote solidarity in Canada right now in this critical and highly risky environment, because there's been talk of Canada retaliating dollar for dollar. I noticed Minister Joly, she had teary eyes just a couple of days ago after listening to President Trump say that on February 1st, they're going to take some tariff action against Canada. And so this is really an existential moment for us. And I'm wondering, apart from retaliating in some way, how could we, in a Canadian context, promote solidarity, which is not an economic policy issue? That's more of a sociological, political, psychological concept. How can we make Canadians be more proud of who we are, like putting the Canadian flag next to the US flag there, because it says the US-Canada border. There are two countries here, right? Not just, and so because I've been reading that over the past 30 years, there's been a significant decline in the number of immigrants who become Canadian citizens. 30% decline. 30 years ago it was 75%. Now it's 45%, and Statistics Canada put out a report to this effect. And that's highly worrying, especially in an environment like this. Your northern neighbor wants to come and gobble you up, and your people are not proud of who they are. Well, that's not a good situation. So that's the question. How can we promote solidarity?
So maybe we'll take two more. So take a slate of 3 questions, and then our panel can answer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that panel discussion. My name's Eve, and I'm an MGA student here. I think one thing that was really interesting about the US election was just there was a lot of conversation about how Trump won the Hispanic and Latino vote, and also a lot of second and third generation immigrants voting for Trump. I was just wondering, do you see the potential for these trends to emerge in Canada?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this amazing panel. I had a question specific for Marta. Hello. I was wondering what role can and should Canadian consulates and the embassy play in solidifying the US-Canada relationship in the upcoming months? And how will the upcoming Canadian election complicate their ability to maintain this relationship as we enter the caretaking period? And also, given that most ambassadors or head of missions or consul generals were appointed by the Trudeau government and have spent a decade forging relationships at the state, federal, and municipal levels.
Okay. Why don't
Can
you
I go
start?
first then?
Yeah.
Okay, great questions. Okay, so I'm gonna, on the first question, I think it's a great question. Look, I think that and this situation that we're in may, I hope will spur us there to have a national conversation about how we promote solidarity and what Canada means and what Canada's about and why Canada matters in the world. I kind of think of it as sort of a three-legged stool: solidarity, resilience, and reaction, right? Because we also know that there's a lot that we can do to build our own economic resilience as well. And this is sort of, I think, forcing that conversation, whether it's going to get a little nerdy, but whether it's internal trade barriers or whether it's the incentives for innovation in Canada and startup and scale up. Like there's a whole range of issues that have sort of been kind of there for a while about how we increase our own productivity and growth and resilience. So I would say solidarity, resilience, and reaction, right? We have to be prepared for what's coming and we have to have a good strategy. I'll go straight to the last question, which is about Canada, the consulates and the embassy. Look, I think that the consulates and embassies, the foreign service is part of the public service. The public service continues to operate even during an election. You've seen with this government sort of starting before the election, the kind of outreach of multiple ministers traveling all over the US. You've seen premiers, making sure that they've got strong relationships with the adjacent governors, right? I think across the board, Canadians are seized with Canadian leaders are appropriately seized with the need to, be building and strengthening those relationships in the face of this time of challenge. And I don't think that'll stop during an election campaign. I mean, everything goes a little bit lower during an election because, you do sort of, the public service does a lot less that's kind of public and out there. But I don't think this is an area where there's a lot of political controversy that we should be doing that. We should be having the meetings. We should be making the case for Canada.
Thanks. Who's next?
I can jump in on the solidarity question. I think it's a great question. I think it's connected to this point that I made. What is it? What actually in a global context, which we are in, I'm not assuming, people are talking about shortening the supply chain, right? The global supply chains. They're not saying we're not going to have supply chains that are going to be beyond the country, right? So I'm not assuming any country is just going to be insular, right? Let's assume we are in a current era where we do have to interact with other countries. It's an interesting question of what does it really mean to have citizenship in a particular country? And I would not read too much into that data, although I know the statistics are there, but part of the explanation to me, the more interesting explanation that has been coming out is that you really need to look at the minute numbers, right? And it seems like people who are not naturalizing because becoming a Canadian citizen would impair their home country citizenship. China in particular, you can't have dual nationality. That's for you. If you're an immigrant coming to this country, you might be absolutely feeling that this is your new home country and you care about it. You might still not naturalize because you want to maintain your relationship with the former home country. I don't see that in any way as breaching solidarity. I do think that more generally, it's not a problem of Canada or China. We should globally have some kind of a system that regulates dual nationality. It's striking to me that we don't even have an agreement on that. It's totally bilateral or multilateral or unilateral. So I actually think we need to have a much broader rethink about citizenship in a global era. And again, I wouldn't read too much into that data. It's saying that people are not particularly connected to a given community. My interpretation, what my vision would be, is to say we need a much more of a ground up kind of approach to membership. And I think that fits with it's not Mario, right? That actually fits with a lot. There's now people talking about solidarity studies. If it comes from the ground up, we might have a different configuration. It might mean that localities matter more than just national identities. And we might have to renegotiate for cross-border communities it's a different sense of identity, which is really interconnected with other countries. That's not unique only to Canada, US. You have many other regions where you do have this kind of interaction. The European Union having its own debates. Personally, I think if we work from the ground up and really care about what we would call civil links in the literature, I think that would do a lot of magic. I am also concerned about citizenship being eroded from a totally different direction. We didn't talk about that, Phil, but birthright citizenship, right? The US current debate. That is really something that, at least for the US, being a traditional use solely a territorial based citizenship regime, If that changes, that would be very, very radical. And it probably wouldn't change through an executive order to begin with, right? It's a constitutional protection. So if it ever had to be changed, it's not even just Congress couldn't just do it, right? You need to have an amendment. It's a very, very complicated procedure. It's not impossible. Ireland did that. They had a jus soli, which was absolute, and they restricted it. They said, no, it does matter on the status of the parent, but it's a very, very different configuration than this one. My real worry is not that. It's really that citizenship is being commodified heavily. So if you're super wealthy, you can buy citizenship in the world now. The golden passports. I actually think that's a greater threat to me than someone who's already in the community, not naturalizing for perhaps a really good set of reasons. So what I want to say is we need to be much more minute and careful about what builds solidarity, and not just go by here specific numbers or some kind of alarming statements, which again could stick, but I would want to be a little bit more critical about what's really going on.
I can go, yeah. I mean, I like this question about solidarity. Certainly the America First agenda is not about solidarity between the US and any other country in the world. And, you know, so maybe that's why we only have one flag up on the screen. And I agree with you, Isla, that building solidarity is gonna be really important to moving forward, you know, and that it will come from the ground up, and it will come from reinvesting ourselves in an awareness of how we're interconnected with each other. To turn to this question about demographics and Trump voters and the, you know, rise of conservatives who are people of color and or descendants of immigrants. There's always been, since there's been immigration across the US-Mexico border, there's been tension between Mexican Americans and Mexican newcomers. There's been political and cultural divisions. So that itself is not like a new phenomenon. I think that one of the ways that people have been writing about the changes in the racial formation around white supremacy and the right in the United States, they've been thinking about how gender is one of the places where solidarity is being built, or kind of bringing the disparate elements together. So yes, politics around trans stuff, but also anti-feminist politics and anti-LGBT politics overall. And then the other thing, of course, which we've addressed over and over today is economic precarity and scarcity and this insecurity that people felt. And I think I've read some news coverage after January 6, 2021, that the common thread among those who'd been arrested that day for invading the US Capitol was they had some sort of experience of economic precariousness that, you know, was perhaps the common thread that was holding the whole thing together. So those are, I mean, those are vectors for building unity in a really disparate right in the United States. And that translates over into Canada as well. There's recruitment to the Canadian right through manosphere type social media programming, and also this idea of Western chauvinism, right? This idea that like, it doesn't matter where my family is from, I am committing myself to the ideas of universal truth from the Western tradition. That's what just like the research I've reviewed has said.
Maybe just one more comment on that from the Canadian perspective is, I mean, you have seen immigrant communities in Canada switch from, you know, back and forth between different Canadian political parties. And, you know, I don't think it's quite the same phenomenon that it has been in the US, where it's been sort of, we're now seeing a bit of a trend that people are wondering about. You know, I think you have seen those communities move back and forth, and, you know, it's part of the, you know, part of the political strategies of different political parties is, and, you know, I think that's one of the reason why the discussion about immigration in Canada has been more about sort of, about good management of an immigration system, as opposed to sort of trying to stir up anti-immigration kind of rhetoric. We partly because we have such a different electoral system, and because, you know, we have had a lot of success with immigration. It's a big part of our culture. It's a big part of what Canada is. And there's been sort of a consensus about, that this is a positive thing and that, we need to do better at parts of it. But part of that, I think, is because we do have had such a large amount of immigration, and it plays in a very different way in our political system.
Yeah, just a few thoughts. I don't have an answer to your original question about solidarity, but if I can really, lean into my role as a newcomer, albeit a very privileged one, I would say that I'm actually writing an essay about what is Canadianness.
Please tell us.
Yeah, well, it really has a real high risk of going sideways and being very chin scratchy, but hopefully will be avoided. I've really been keenly observing, points of entry to participating in Canadian society and community as someone who comes here with small children and would like to do this, even though my time here will be limited. And we can talk about what that is, but one of the things I have observed, and take it or leave it, is that because this moment of reflecting on what it is to be a Canadian, what is Canada? It's a retrospective and prospective question. What is it? What has it been? What will it be? This moment of acutely examining identity is coinciding with the end of a political era and a lot of accumulated discontent, rightly or wrongly, fairly or not, and fatigue with the outgoing, I have to say it, the outgoing prime minister, because it is so personified in him, again, rightly or wrongly, fairly or not. What I've observed is this entertaining of the sort of Trump adjacent claims that Canada deserves it. Canada deserves to be annexed because look, this is the outcome of the 10 years of poor stewardship of the country, and this is why this is happening. And when I first moved here, what was a really big thing was Canada's broken. The slogan, and a lot of pollsters were asking people, do you think Canada's broken? Why is it broken? And there were various reasons people cited. And so I feel that this redirection to people to discuss what it is to be Canadian and to participate in this identity is coming at a really negative time for people's feelings. But again, as with so many things that we've been discussing tonight, I think that's a really dynamic situation. I think it can very easily change. And if anything, actually, I think being called, why are you proud to be what you are? I'm seeing a lot of Canadian flags on people's social media handles. It can really be a moment of, discussion, debate, clarity, and solidarity, and across political divides too. And then just on your question about second, third generation immigrants voting for Trump, I think it is an established trend that some of these communities actually turn to shift conservative when in many of the immigrant-based countries, after they feel safe in their citizenship and their children's citizenship and participation. Some of that is culturally and religiously explainable because some of the communities that they come from tend to be more conservative religiously, but not entirely. I think some of the interesting questions coming from those voting trends that you cited in your question pertain to particularly Arab Americans voting for Trump on account of the situation in the Middle East and the treatment of the Biden administration, the treatment of the war between Israel and Hamas and its impact on Gaza. So I'm not sure those translate here. Marta spoke to the partisan political, and this is much maligned and criticized, the kind of idea of playing ethnic politics, but in a weird way, that also means that there's second, third generation immigrants voting for all the parties because there has been such an active participation and integration of those communities in parties across the political spectrum.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we have time for another 3 questions and very fast answers from the panel.
Hi, so my name is Valeria. I'm an MA student with the University of Toronto in the political science program. My question is kind of more regarding the work sector. So one of the promises that Trump made was to get rid of those systems in the workplace that kind of create like this unconscious bias. So like a lot of people when they go in, let's say that you are a Black person, there are a couple of companies and stuff that will have stuff to account for the fact that, people that are interviewing might have an unconscious bias, and Trump got rid of that. And I am wondering how this idea of starting to frame immigrants as illegal or as aliens and stuff are going to affect the workplace in America. And if you think that if Pierre Poilievre were to go into government, if he would implement something similar, or if these systems would still stay. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the discussion. My name is Craig. I teach some courses here, and I also do research on migration, and I've spent a bunch of time on the Canada-US border and the US-Mexico border. Just a point on the solidarity thing. One thing I think that's interesting to note is that a lot of what we call the settlement sector in Canada, these large organizations that are funded by the IRCC largely, at least in the 70s and 80s, started as part of sanctuary movements or solidarity movements, have now become more institutionalized, but I think that there will be an uptick in that. The question aspect of that is whether or not the cracking down on spaces of sanctuary and solidarity movements in the US will impact how people see that impacting on Canada as well. And the other just very quick point, and maybe it's not so much of a question, but like Canada's seen, despite the change in the STCA, which was very clearly designed to like forward-looking on a second Trump administration, so that Canada or whatever government was in power didn't face that pressure 4 years or 2 years later. The asylum rates in Canada have grown exponentially. Over 2023 to 2024, it doubled to 64,000 from 32, and now it's like 135,000 asylum claims with a massive backlog and an IRB that can't possibly scale to do those types of claims, that scale of claims. And then I guess for the folks with more expertise in government, whether or not a new conservative government would fundamentally change the practices of the IRB as an independent tribunal, go back to putting it under the minister's discretion entirely, and then what that might look like for Canada.
Hi, my name is Maeve and I'm a student here. I'm wondering if Trump's inaugurations and his immediate shocking actions during that might impact the outcome of Canada's next federal election. I know that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives have been a shoo-in for a while, but I'm just wondering if the sheer shock of any of the conservatism in the States might turn people towards more left-wing political parties in Canada.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to start?
I'll go and then I'll try to be fast. So in response to the first question about the dramatic, cutting off of resources to DEI, initiatives and whatnot in workplaces, and then also rhetoric around illegal aliens, so-called, which is, those are the government's terms. It's that term is actually written into law. Yeah, and also Trump during his speech, he talked about color blindness, right? So it's what he's trying to maybe drive us back into this era of colorblind racism. Colorblind discourses and rhetoric are a place where is a place where racist practices can thrive really I mean, that's what we saw in the US actually in the 80s and 90s. And the rhetoric that will be used around immigration, at least for this year, this is the rhetoric that's in play now, is criminality, the idea of criminals and people who are unauthorized immigrants being equated with criminals. And that word criminal already is racially loaded. So we're transposing a meaning that associates that word with Black folks in the US historically. That's kind of how that racial connection worked around that word criminal. That's being transposed onto unauthorized immigrants. And of course, when we're talking about immigrants, we're not talking about Elon Musk, even though he immigrated from the African continent, right? So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I expect to see, deepen. And I hope that answered your question enough or responded in the way that you were hoping for a response. And then there was something in the next question that just reminded me, I don't have an answer to your question about the settlement sector and sanctuary spaces, but I remembered that we haven't mentioned yet how technological change has really driven the rise in migration since COVID, and access to social media and cell phones in what's sometimes called the developing world or sometimes called the global South is part of what's driven it. And so we see this rise in asylum seekage here in Canada that parallels the rise in asylum seekage in the US. And a lot of that has to do with decentralized organization through social media.
Yeah, okay, so I'll take a couple of those. One is on the issue of kind of the IRB and all that kind of stuff. I couldn't predict what a new government will do, but just to say, you've already seen this government take a number of actions to roll back decisions that were taken post-COVID that resulted in a large increase in immigration, a large increase in temporary workers, a large increase in students, and a large increase in asylum seekers. And that was the result of a number of decisions that were taken in at the time that seemed to make sense, that government took in good faith, but that resulted in sort of unintended consequences. And so that's why you've seen sort of this kind of one by one kind of rollback of some of those decisions. When you got a big backlog like you do at the IRB right now, it takes a long time to sort of work for institutions to work their way through that. And so, I think there's just going to be these issues are going to take a while to resolve. But even with this government, you've seen policy change, you've seen policy adjustment as a result. And then on the other question about Canada-US, look, I think the Canada-US relationship, I think what's going on in the US is going to impact everything about the next election, but I don't think anybody knows how.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think the NDP and the Liberal Party are sure hoping that Donald Trump's election and threats against Canada will, provide them with a bit of electoral bounce. But, we'll see. I think it's going to be an exciting time in Canadian politics that we're all going to be watching really closely.
I agree.
Yeah, I can go. I actually want to answer a question that was part of the first round and also just echoed with the question about the political impacts, and actually really picking up, Mark, on where you finished. Obviously, we don't know, but I do think that, to me, the big puzzle, and that is, I'm hoping some people in the room are doing some research. I don't know, Craig, if you're doing it or others are doing it, but just really understanding the settled migrants in Canada who are citizens, obviously, so they can vote. What is their perception? What is their critique of the government? Anecdotally, we hear some newcomers actually making complaints which are very, very similar to very, very settled citizens. So in some way, I want to say that's exactly right. That means you're already feeling you're sufficiently of an insider that you can make exactly the same complaint about someone you just came 3 years ago, but you're, I've been here forever and ever, right? And it's the last closes the door. So that might be one response, sort of saying, I'm in, but no one else should come in. It could be saying that perhaps immigrant communities, I don't know if this is empirically correct, but with the temporary admissions, perhaps with your international students, would it be that they had more of the responsibility? Maybe it's a family member that you can't just say, I'm not going to care for you, but you never really thought that they would be here forever. You thought they would come in for 2 years and not. So I'm just wondering if partly what's happening is that the immigrant communities, the settled immigrant communities themselves have their own narrative about the governmental changes in policy. And that could be a big question mark. That could actually be, at least in the GTA, right? That would be a game changer if that's really true. So I'm just curious, and I don't know, and I would love to actually hear if anyone has done some empirical research, really doing just very close interviews with those communities and trying to understand what's their perception, where do they fall on these issues, given their voting power in our current electoral system. That would be a crucial demographic to explore. So that's really an invitation for anyone who's working in the field to try and think through these issues. I think that would give us some clarity, or at least some indication of what the potential directions might be.
What was the earlier question you wanted to answer?
Oh, I think I combined it.
I think my only point would be, I would not assume that voters in Canada will look south and be terrified and vote left in response. I think you are likely to see a group of voters who look south and say, this looks great. This is what I want. I feel empowered to say it out loud, and they will vote right. But I completely agree with Mata that everything playing out, including the Liberal leadership race and the federal election when it happens, will be through the Trump lens, when it starts with the Liberals, who's best to negotiate with him, who do we think is better suited in this moment of economic, policymaking being very central. And then I think the personalities of the two people who will be running to become prime minister in the federal election will also be judged greatly through the Trump lens. But I wouldn't assume it will be a boon for the left.
I do remember my second point, if I can just say it. I think what we've seen in Europe, which actually worries me tremendously, is that when immigration becomes as politicized as it seems to have become in Canada, which for many years, as Phil, actually your writing has shown this, it actually has been far less political. But if it's politicized, what we have seen is that if you have a real strong far right kind of position on immigration, even if the centrist governments or parties try to move a little bit to the right, it goes to the right, right? So they can't actually beat the far right, because if someone's saying, I'm going to vote on immigration, they'll go all the way. So I think that would be something very, very, very concerning actually in Canada, if that's the pattern that we will see. But again, we need to know much more before we can make any predictions.
Yeah, no, I think that's laying down a research agenda is the way to end an academic panel. So thank you, everyone. That was, I had really high expectations, but they've been exceeded, and it was a wonderful discussion. And thank you for your attendance and your questions. And we'll see how it goes. Have a good night.